Moving on, ladies and gentlemen, for the keynote, we have a gentleman who needs no introduction, absolutely. He is the co-founder, Group Managing Director, and CEO of Olam International Limited. In short, he is responsible for every inch of the success this company has garnered. It is listed on the main board of the Singapore Exchange and ranks among the top 40 countries in Singapore in terms of market capitalization. He is also currently the chairman of the International Enterprise of Singapore, which is a statutory board under the Ministry of Trade and Industry. In May 2010, he was appointed as for the Ministry of Manpower Singapore to serve as chairman of the Board of Human Capital Leadership Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, to deliver the keynote at this Golden Jubilee CISL's IPTC annual convention, please welcome Group MD, CEO Olam International Limited, Chairman International Enterprise Singapore, Mr. Sunny G. Verghese.
Mr. Hakan, President CISL, Mr. Gavin Gibson, CEO CISL, Mr. Gautam, CEO DMCC, members of CISL, Executive Committee of CISL, delegates to the 2013 World Pulses Convention, CISL World Pulses Convention, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, delighted to be here this morning. And on behalf of IE Singapore and the government of Singapore, I'm delighted to welcome all the delegates to this conference. We are particularly proud in hosting this conference in Singapore this year, given that it is also a major milestone in CISL's history that is now celebrating this year its 50th anniversary. So congratulations to all of you who made CISL such a vibrant trade organization. In my capacity as CEO of Olam, I'm privileged to attend many trade conferences, particularly because Olam is in about 16 commodity platforms, 44 agricultural commodities. So I get an opportunity to visit some of these trade congresses every year. I notice a special sense of vibrancy in CISL, and that is really marked by, one, the absence of large global mega traders. And two, the vibrancy comes from a lot of entrepreneurial, family-owned businesses. Some of the people I spoke to this morning before we started this program are third-generation family-owned businesses and fourth-generation family-owned businesses. And that is a hallmark of truly building long-lasting, sustainable businesses and keeping the family spirit and the entrepreneurial spirit alive. So I'm delighted to be here amongst your midst this morning. My keynote today is organized into three parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the long-term trends in the agricultural complex, in the agricultural sector. In the second part, I'm going to briefly talk about the role of pulses in the agricultural complex. But to the people who are experts in that sector, I think my value addition, given the insights that you have on the global pulses industry, would be limited. And finally, I'd like to speak about the role of Singapore in facilitating the global pulses trade. And there I'm in some friendly, healthy competition with Gautam and DMCC. And I think there's room and scope for all of us to try and attract you to be anchored in our respective jurisdictions. So let me move on to the first part and try and identify the long-term trends in the agricultural complex. And before I identify those trends, I just want to present a couple of data points on the seriousness of the food security issue that President Hakan mentioned and also Gautam alluded to. So if you look at the 11 years since 2000, the first 4 years between 2000 and 2003, the FAO World Food Price Index hovered between a range of 90 to 97. This includes tracking 55 price series across 5 major food categories: meat, dairy, cereals, sugar. So 5 categories, 55 price series. In the next 4 years, between 2004 and 2007, that index moved from 90 to 97 in the previous 4 years to something like 112 to 158. And then in the last 5 years, from 2008 to 2012, that index hovered between 158 and 235. In 3 out of the 5 years between 2008 and 2012, the FAO Food Price Index had breached the 200 mark. We had the first food price scare in 2008 June, when this index reached a reading of 220. And that was sandwiched between the Bear Stearns collapse in January and the Lehman collapse in September of that year. So under very stressful conditions, you saw food prices hit the 220 mark. And at that point in time, we said food prices, this is a cyclical phenomenon, not a structural phenomenon, because lo and behold, with the global financial crisis, food prices retraced back. And in 2009, it reached again 158, and everybody was relieved. But in February 2011, food prices shot up again to 235, a lifetime high not seen before. And then in September 2012, food prices was about 225. Now, this is significant only because the last major food price crisis that we've had was in 1974. After 1974, we've really had an era of food surpluses and declining real food prices. So having 3 food price scares in a matter of 4 years or 5 years is significant because it hasn't happened in the past. And therefore, we need to pause and ask ourselves the question, is the food price increases that we witnessed in the last 4 or 5 years a cyclical phenomenon, or is there something more structural to the story? So that's the first issue. And as we all saw, during that food price crisis in 2008, 2011, 2012, there were riots in several countries, particularly in the 2008 food price crisis, where 47 countries rioted. There were several deaths. There was panic reaction from various governments. As the Chinese proverb says, civilization and anarchy are just 7 meals apart. If you go hungry, try that. Don't eat for 7 meals in a row. You will react very differently. Some of the source of the tension that we saw in the Middle East, etc., was a combination of high proportion of unemployed, educated youth, and with 50, 60% food price inflation, when they were spending 60 to 70% of the consumption expenditure on food consumption. You have very little to lose when you have that combination of circumstances. So if we can fight wars over oil, we would fight bigger wars over food if this becomes a real issue. But right from several centuries ago, Malthus first scared us about an impending food security issue. And after all these years of being able to adequately feed our growing population, we've all begun to assume that that is not an issue anymore. So really, let's look at some of the key supply side and demand side drivers and make an assessment of what the future of food prices are and food security is. Let us start with the demand side drivers. And the first demand side driver is the growing population. And that is not a new phenomenon. We've all coped with the growing global population in the past. But it's important to note that in October of 2012, we became 7 billion people on the planet. It took us all of mankind in 1800 to become 1 billion people on the planet. Then a whole 130 years to double it from 1 to 2 billion. And then just 33 years to move from 2 billion to the next billion, 3 billion. And from 3 to 4, it was 15 years. And 4 to 5, it was 13 years. And 5 to 6, and 6 to 7, it was 12 years apart. We are going to be 9.2 billion people on the planet by 2050. Nigeria in Africa is the largest populated African nation, 150 million people today. By 2050, 385 million people, according to this projection. And by 2100, 1 billion people in Nigeria. This is the UN Population Commission's projections on employment, on population, right? So if you're going to have 75, 80 million mouths to feed each year, you obviously need to grow the food produced to be able to cope with the demand. But that's not a new issue, not a difficult issue to cope with if you have increased productivity. The second phenomenon that we are facing, and which is a game changer, is the massive growth of the middle class in the transitioning economies. Today, the world has roughly 1.85 billion people in the middle class. In the last 30 years, 770 million people was added. So 1.15 became 1.85 today, right? In the next 20 years, it is expected that the middle class will grow by 3 billion people against the 1.85 billion people we are today. Of the 3 billion additional people added to the middle class, 90% will be in Asia. Today, out of the 1.85 billion middle class population, 53 million is from Asia. And that, 0.53 billion is from Asia. That 0.53 billion is going to grow to about 3.23 billion in just Asia in terms of middle class growth. And that is going to have a significant ramp-up demand in calorie consumption. As a rough rule of thumb, low-income countries consume about 2,500 calories of food per capita. The middle-income countries is about 3,000, and the high-income countries is about 3,600. So as people migrate or transition from a low-income population to a middle-income population, you can see a significant growth in calorie consumption. And that is the second driver. And if you look at this phenomenon, it is really transformational. If you look at UK during the Industrial Revolution, it took the UK 154 years to double the per capita income from $1,300 to $2,600. And they had a population base at that time of 10 million. The US, starting roughly 50 years later, doubled their per capita income from 1,300 to 2,600, again on a population base of 10 million. It took them 54 years. Germany, when they started their progress and development, took 65 years to double the per capita income similarly, but on a population base which was higher, 28 million people. Right? Japan, post the Second World War, took 33 years to double the per capita income, dramatically faster, and on a population base of 48 million. Korea took 16 years to double the per capita income. China is today taking 11 to 12 years to double the per capita income, but on a scale of 1.4 billion people, not 28, not 48, not 10, but on 1.4 billion people. And India is taking 16 years to double the per capita income on a population base of 1.3 billion people. So this growth in middle class is happening at a revolutionary, transformational pace right before our eyes. And it has never, ever happened in the past. It is at 200 times the scale of what we have witnessed in the past. It is at about 10 times the speed of what we have witnessed in the past. And that will drive calorie consumption. The third big demand-side driver is the transitioning of the dietary habits from a cereal carbohydrate-based diet to a more protein and fats-based diet. One of the reasons that Pulse's per capita consumption has declined from something like 11 to about 8.5 kgs per capita is largely because of this upgradation in the dietary habits of the major transitioning economies. So China in the mid-80s used to consume about 15 kgs of meat per capita. Today it consumes about 52 kgs of meat per capita. In the US, the consumer consumes about 110 kgs of meat per capita. In Australia and New Zealand, is about 125 kgs of meat per capita. In the past, when we looked at these trends and we said, but China, India, they will never consume as much meat as the Western populations do, because it's a cultural thing. But Taiwan and Hong Kong, which are only greater parts of China, today consume about 100 kgs of meat per capita. So it's all about economics. If you can afford it, you want to consume more proteins and more meat and more. So if you look at Chinese consumption today, China consumes 50% of all the pork or pig meat that is produced in the world. It consumes 40% of all the eggs produced in the world. It consumes 16% of all the poultry meat produced in the world. It consumes 10% of all the beef that is produced in the world. It consumes 30% of all the rice that is produced in the world, 16% of all the wheat that is produced, 25% of all the soybeans that is produced in the world. Obviously, to produce a kg of poultry meat, you need 2 kgs of feed grains. And to produce a kg of pork meat, you need about 4 kgs of feed grains. And to produce a kg of beef meat, you need about 7 to 8 kgs of feed grains. So as the Chinese population increases the per capita consumption of meat, there'll be a multiplier ramp-up effect on the demand for feed raw materials, which is why China this year imported 60 million tons of soybeans. And by 2015 is expected to import nearly 90 million tons of soybeans. If China was to become self-sufficient in soybean production, to produce this 60 million tons that they imported this year, they have to set aside about 37 million hectares of land additional for soybean cultivation. The total acreage under food crop cultivation in China is 90 million hectares and hasn't grown 1 hectare for the last 15 years. The Chinese government in the current 12th development plan, 5-year development plan, has said that the red line to meet food self-sufficiency, which is defined as 95% food self-sufficiency, they need 122 million hectares. China has no hope of putting 122 million hectares under cultivation. We believe Chinese acreage under cultivation today has already come down to about 119. We believe it will come down further to 116. It is losing about 0.8% of its arable land each year. Right? I remember in 2004 when Chinese grain production came down to 430 million tons, the Chinese government got very upset and made sure to come up with very tighter legislation to bar any conversion of commercial land into arable land and banned any more golf courses being built on arable land. Since 2004 and today, about 460 new golf courses have come up in China on arable land because the provincial authorities just reclassified that land as wasteland, and wasteland can be used for any purpose. Right? So there is that pressure. The other big issue that we are seeing is as if this was not enough, in the past, there were 3 sources of demand for food raw materials, or agricultural raw materials, which is the 3 Fs, food, feed, and fiber. Now there's a 4th F, the fuel complex. So 40% of all the corn produced in the US last year went into ethanol manufacturing. 50% of the sugarcane produced in Brazil went into ethanol manufacturing. 10% of all the world oil seeds has been diverted into biodiesel manufacturing. About 11% of the world's acreage today is devoted to crops being produced for fuel purposes. And as both Gautam and Hakan mentioned, we need to increase food production by 70% to meet the growing demands and all of these trends. And we have to do it with our hands tied behind our backs. Because if you look at the supply side, there are lots of constraints. The first major constraint on the supply side is decreasing arable land. And as I showed you in China, land is decreasing at between 0.5 and 0.8% per year. If you look at where the world's arable land that is left is, it is in very difficult countries with very poor infrastructure. So about 60% of the world's effective arable land is now in Africa. But it has got very significant infrastructure deficits. If you look at China, in the last 8 years, Chinese tractorization has moved from 1 million tractors to 4 million tractors, quadrupled. Chinese fertilizer usage has gone up by 40%. China's area under irrigation is 70%. African area under irrigation is less than 10%. Tractorization is a small part of the total modernization of their agricultural and the farming systems. If you look at India pulse production, average yields 0.65 tons per hectare. Canadian average yields 1.6 tons per hectare. But we have to recognize and accept that there are 2 farming systems. There is the smallholder farming system, and there's the large mechanized farming system like in Canada, Australia, Brazil, the US. And some pundits tell me that, we can solve all our problems if we can get into mechanized, efficient scale agriculture. But India, China, and the developing countries will never get to scale agriculture. They cannot, because in China, 550 million people are engaged in agriculture. In India, 600 million people are engaged in agriculture. If you try and aggregate lands and get to mechanized scale farming, you have to find jobs for the displaced people who are currently engaged in agriculture. And if the US cannot find jobs for 14, 15 million unemployed people, how the hell can China or India ever hope to find jobs for 500 million people or 450 million people that could be potentially displaced from that system? So we have to really say that both these systems have to work side by side. And we need productivity breakthroughs that will help smallholder farmers within their constraints to maximize yield and productivity. And at the same time, we need to do that for the larger systems as well. The second supply side issue is that we are having declining agricultural productivity growth rate. Between the 1960 and 1990, when much of the world green revolution happened in developing countries, including India, you saw productivity growth rate grow by an annual rate of about 2.2, 2.3%. Between 1990 and today, it has halved to about 1.1%. Because most of the low-hanging fruits in terms of productivity breakthroughs have already been realized and harvested. And agricultural research to find the next productivity breakthrough has completely disappeared because it was all public institutional research. And at the time of food price issues, There was massive public institutional research funding. The FAO committee of experts have established that we need about $70 to $85 billion annual spend in agricultural research to find the next breakthroughs. Current spending on agricultural research, public institutional research, is $4 to $5 billion. We spend $1.6 trillion on our defense budgets globally. But this is where the priorities of policymakers are very different. So I don't see a big revolutionary breakthrough in productivity coming our way if this is the investment that we have in research. The third big issue is water. Look at the water issue that we have today. The UN Commission has now said that 37% of the world population by 2015 will be having absolute water constraints. What does it mean? Today we use about 4.5 trillion cubic meters of water. 71% of that goes into agriculture, 22% of that goes into industrial use, and the balance, 6 to 8%, is for household consumption. Today morning, before I came here, I had a very sumptuous breakfast because I had a breakfast meeting. I had a slice of toast. It takes 40 liters of water to produce a slice of toast. Then I had a roasted tomato, 23 liters of water. I'm not making up these numbers. For those of you who are interested, I'll give you those sources. Okay? I had 2 fried eggs, 270 liters of water. I had a cup of coffee, 150 liters of water. I had a cereal with some milk in it, 120 liters of water. I consumed 1,000 liters of water this morning at my breakfast. The rough rule of thumb is you consume 1 liter of water for every calorie you consume. And in Singapore, we consume 3,600 calories on an average per day. So we consume 3,600 liters of water, plus another 50 liters of water for our household needs in terms of bathing and everything else. Right? So there's a hell of a lot of water that we consume. China has 21% of the world's population, 6% of its water. India has about 20% of the world's population, 8% of its water. Indian water usage for industrial use is going to treble in the next 20 years. Household consumption, water requirements is going to double. If you use, to produce a ton of wheat, I need to use 15 tons, so 1.5 tons of water. 1.5 tons of water will produce a ton of wheat, which is roughly valued at $300 a ton. If I use the same amount of water for industrial use, I will generate $14,000 to $15,000 income. So in China, in the late 80s, early 90s, was using almost 78% of its water for agriculture. Today, it uses 61% of its water for agriculture. In China, in the northern part of China, the groundwater levels are depleting at about 3.5 meters per year. And that grows half its wheat and a third of its corn. In the northwest part of Gujarat in India, water tables are receding at 6.5 meters per year. We are overexploiting the aquifers and the groundwater resources. So we have a huge water problem on our hands. We also have, in addition to that, and when you produce beef and you produce pork, the water requirements are a multiplier impact. So to produce a kg of beef, you need about 15,000 kgs of water. And to produce a kg of pork, you need about 6,000 to 8,000 kgs of water. So water consumption is a big issue. The other significant supply-side issue is the impact of climate change. World temperatures have grown 0.8 degrees in the last 50 years. And that has created havoc in changing climate and weather patterns. Recently in the UK, research was done, what they call the attributional science research, to look at the recent weather events and to try and establish if there is any connectedness between the recent floods and droughts and fires and all that we are seeing with more frequency and prolonged episodes of these climatic events, to see what it had to do with climate change. And they have established a fairly high degree of correlation so that even the most hardened skeptic who believed that this climate change was a fanciful imagination of a few besotted scientists are beginning to now really sit back and say, probably this is real. And the world leaders have not been able to agree on limiting world temperature growth under 2.5 degrees centigrade over the next 50 years. They're still arguing about it. If the consumption patterns progress the way it is expected now, without any further energy usage efficiency, there'll be another 66 gigatons of carbon dioxide that'll be emitted over the next 40 years on the planet. That will increase world temperatures by between 4.5 and 5 degrees centigrade. The worldwide, the WWF and the IPCC, which reiterated that research, have predicted that the Himalayan glaciers are likely to melt somewhere between 2035 and 2040. It supports 7 major river systems: the Ganges in India, the Brahmaputra in Bangladesh, the Indus in Pakistan, the Irrawaddy in Myanmar, the Yangtze and Yellow rivers in China, the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. 1.4, 1.5 billion people dependent on those drainage basins for their livelihood and their agriculture. If you look at Lake Chad in Africa, its water has depleted by 90% over the last 30 years. The Aral Sea water is depleted by about 80% in the last 30 years. So we have a major issue in terms of climate change and the impact of that on agricultural production. We also have a massive logistics and storage infrastructure bottleneck. So today, to move 1 ton of soybean 2,000 miles from Mato Grosso to Port Santos, my logistics cost is $140 a ton. To move the same 1 ton from Minneapolis or where that is grown in the US, 2,000 miles to the Gulf ports, it'll cost me just $38 a ton. To move it the same 2,000 miles in Africa, it'll cost me about $240 a ton. Yeah? The FAO Committee of Experts has established that we need $3.6 trillion investment in agricultural infrastructure over the next 40 years to bridge this gap. And they've estimated that bilateral developmental assistance will amount to about $250 to $400 million out of this. So that is also not going to happen. Because one of the solutions that a lot of pundits give you is that, in all of these countries, developing countries, we waste more than 40 to 60% of the food that we produce. The global average is 30, 35%. Therefore, if we can fix our post-harvest losses, we can fix the supply-demand imbalance. But if you have this kind of infrastructural bottleneck, you have to assume that you're always going to be wasting that 30% waste, unless you can make those investments to bridge that infrastructure gap. And that is difficult to see how and when that will happen. So I know that some of you are getting restless, and that was precisely my objective. I didn't want to really stand here today and reassure you that everything is going very well. I wanted you to feel restless enough so that you will contribute to the solutions to changing this problem, because governments and policymakers are clueless about how to solve this. And they do precisely the opposite things of what is required to lick this problem. So when there is food price inflation, the first thing China or India will do is to put food price controls. If onion prices go up in India, the government will be toppled. And yesterday's Financial Times, I read that tomato prices in Brazil are shooting through the roof, and that is going to put some pressure on Dilma Rousseff, right? And the same thing in China. So none of these governments would want food price inflation. So whenever food prices go up, they immediately put food price controls. When food price controls are there, it distorts the price signals to get a supply response. The farmer is looking to increase productivity only if he sees that it makes economic sense for him. By putting those price controls, you distort those price signals. There's not going to be a supply response which can address the supply-demand in equilibrium. The other thing that the policymakers have said, food price inflation is all because speculators, these greedy, bad speculators around the world are significantly enhancing or magnifying the price, the amplitude of prices by their financial flows into the futures market. Olam, in our company, we deal in 44 agricultural commodities. 55% is non-futures traded cash commodities. There's no futures market there. If you look at the price volatility in the 24 years that we have been in business across derivative commodities with futures markets and cash commodities without futures market, the price volatility in the cash commodities, as you have seen in the pulses business. If I ask any of you, what is your biggest problem, is that the pulses market is always a near-term, short-term, nearby short-term market. You can't sell far forward. I can sell coffee or cocoa 3 years forward, 4 years forward. I cannot sell pulses beyond 2 or 3 months. It's all spot, liquid, nearby business. And therefore, under Sarkozy's presidency of the G20, they invited us to make a presentation to the G20 guys on what our view of food price inflation is. And his view was it was really caused by speculators. And when we provided these data points that doesn't make sense, that doesn't seem to be the case, we were never invited for any other conference by these guys ever after that. OK, let me move on from that to the role of pulses in this complex. Very clearly, one of the only categories within the agricultural complex where per capita consumption is declining is pulses. Even in grains, per capita consumption is growing. But in pulses is one of the few categories within the agricultural complex where per capita consumption is declining. The second issue is because of the bulk of the production being in countries with smallholder farms, productivity is extremely low. Even in India, for example, if you look at the period between 1950 and 2012, pulses production growth was 50% during this period of 62 years or 63 years. Whereas rice production grew by 320% and wheat production grew by 280%. Governments and policymakers always see it as a supplemental crop, an additional crop, no real focus, despite the fact that India accounts for, what, 30% of all world pulse production in terms of consumption? It accounts for 50% of the world trade of pulses. And yet, we haven't seen the same kind of focused effort in research and breakthroughs to bridge the productivity gap. 650 kilos, 0.65 tons per hectare against Canada's 1.6 or 1.65 tons per hectare. The second big issue in pulses, really for me, is the lack of a futures and derivatives market. And since Gautam is sitting here today and I wearing my IE cap, I'm desperate to see that there are some liquid commodity exchanges that come up in Singapore, in Dubai, that can allow producers to hedge forward if there is no physical liquidity in the cash markets beyond 3 and 6 months. And that, I think, will be a very good thing for the farmer, a very good thing for the consumer, because both can lay off the risks in the futures market. Can it happen? Will it happen? Is it a pipe dream? I think CISL can play a catalytical role in enabling that to happen. That is the second thing. And the third thing is really all about counterparty defaults and counterparty management. Given these volatilities in pulse prices that we have all seen, sale is sometimes a useless piece of paper, a sales contract. How do you enforce that? What are the self-regulating mechanisms that the trade association can ensure so that this risk is minimized would be another critical role for the pulses industry. As far as the role of Singapore, or as Gautam has eloquently explained why you should all be in Dubai, let me spend a few minutes trying to persuade you otherwise and to be in Singapore. Why Singapore? For pulses. 60% of all the world trade in pulses is going to happen in this part of the world. Yeah? India, China, Myanmar, the Indian subcontinent, Bangladesh, Pakistan, big consumers. In Myanmar, big producer, exporter, with significant potential to grow. If you look at world trade estimates of growth in world trade is going to grow about 7% according to IMF between now and 2020. But the center of gravity of the world trade is shifting to Asia for the reasons that I mentioned to you earlier about the growing middle class and 90% of the middle class population growth coming into this part of the world. So Singapore is extremely well located at the center of these trade flows to be able to capture both, and it's a neutral position. It's not a producer, it's not a big consumer, so it plays it doesn't talk its book. It can play a neutral position just like Dubai can. But Singapore has a terrific infrastructure. So firstly, if you look at the World Economic Forum's report last year for global trade-enabled report, we were ranked #1 last year in that report. If you look at last year's World Bank rankings on logistics performance index, we were last year ranked #1. We are amongst the top 4 global financial centers in the world. We have more than 500 financial institutions in Singapore. We were also, if you look at the foreign exchange trading centers, we are the second highest in Asia last year, $308 billion of daily trading in foreign exchange. We have 400 global trade houses anchored in Singapore. Last year, their combined turnover was in excess of $1 trillion that they booked in Singapore. Some of the majors, like Louis Dreyfus Commodities last year, made its debut in public capital markets by issuing a $350 million perpetual bond in Singapore. Just 2 weeks ago or a week ago, Trafigura, the third largest energy trading company, also issued a $500 million perpetual bond. It's first of its kind in public capital markets. So the public capital markets is not just bank source of funding, but we all saw in the global financial crisis how silly it was to be just dependent on banks for source of funding. You need to broad base your source of funding across all pools of debt capital and all pools of equity capital to really be surviving over the long term. In that context, with global contestability increasing, in 1998 or 1997, world GDP was only $28 trillion. At that time, about $6 trillion was globally contestable. Everything else was protected by tariffs, barriers, and everything else. About roughly 22% of world GDP was contestable. In 2012, world GDP was $82 trillion. About 30% roughly was contestable. $27 trillion out of the $82 trillion was contestable. By 2025, we expect world trade to be, world GDP to be about $125 trillion. But 80% will be contestable. And Singapore, like Dubai, is one of the most free, open, pro-business environment cities in the world, city-states in the world. So I'd welcome all of you to consider anchoring some part of your businesses here. And IE will extend all help to facilitate that. I wish all the delegates here a great conference. I keep telling my colleagues in OLAM, we live in an information surplus, knowledge surplus world, because we are in a Google era. So today, anything you want to know about anything, you can Google and find out. But we live in a really insight deficit world. What I think conferences like this can achieve is to convert knowledge into insight. Through all the interactions and the patterns of experiences that all of you are going to be sharing over the next 2 days, I think you can achieve that, and I wish all of you a great convention. Thank you.
We'd like to make it special for our keynote speaker and our very special guest by presenting them with mementos on behalf of this occasion. May I please request the President Cecil to do us the honors. Ladies and gentlemen, may I request Ludwika to help us with this. You know Ludwika, she's one of the key members of this team that's made this event such a success. First off, course, to Gautam. Gautam Sashital, CEO, Dubai Multi-Commodity Exchange. And of course, to Sunny George Verghese of Olam International Limited. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Bahichi.